Hi everyone, welcome. We're just gonna let everyone join today's seminar and then we'll start. So welcome, and we'll start in just 30 seconds or so. Okay, why don't we get rolling? I see we've passed the 20 participants mark here, so and I'm sure others will be joining. But I have the pleasure of welcoming everyone to our bi-weekly Berman Institute of Bioethics seminar series. We have the pleasure of co-hosting today's seminar with the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy. And also have the pleasure of having our speaker, Barbara Evans, with us today, who I'll introduce shortly. We oftentimes have opportunities to cover a diverse range of topics through these seminars, and we're delighted that Barbara was able to join us today to share her really interesting work on rules for robots. The title is her presentation, and why artificial intelligence and machine learning medical software breaks them. And Barbara is a professor of law and Stephen C. O'Connell Chair of the University of Florida Levens College of Law, and professor of engineering as well at UF's Herbert Wertheim College of Engineering. So she has sort of the benefit of being in these two worlds and bringing that perspective to bear on this topic. Her work focuses significantly on issues involving data privacy and the regulation of machine learning, and, as well as issues related to genomic technologies and diagnostic tests. She's an elected member of the American Law Institute and a senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, where she was named also a Greenwell Fellow, faculty scholar in bioethics from 2010 to 2013. Prior to coming to academia, she was a partner in the international regulatory practice of a large New York law firm, and has been admitted to practice law in New York and Texas as well. She has a BS in electrical engineering from the University of Texas, Austin, a master's and PhD from Stanford University, and a JD from Yale Law, as well as an LLM in health law from the University of Houston Law Center. She completed postdoc training in clinical ethics at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. So as you can tell, Dr. Evans brings a really broad and interesting background and experience to this topic, and we're delighted to have you here, Barbara, and I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that introduction. And I'm going to be using slides, so I'm going to go ahead and share them now. Have I been successful?
Looks great.
Great. I'd like to talk about ways that medical AI presents some issues that are different from the issues that are concerning people about AI in our society more generally. Am I muted?
You are not muted now, but you were briefly.
Okay. Okay, well, I don't have any conflicts to disclose, and I want to talk about how medical AI is distinct from some of the problems we see with AI more generally. I can't get this to advance.
You may have to click on the screen, I believe, and then try either your right arrow or
there we go.
There we go.
And I'm going to focus on 4 ways that AI, machine learning, clinical decision support software breaks some of the rules that have been enunciated for other types of AI. And we'll be coming back to these in detail, but the first relates to some distinct privacy and data access issues and the need for a different model of privacy than we've been using for the last 30 to 50 years. I also want to talk about the problem of bias in clinical decision support software, which can cause software not to work well for some of the patients who come before doctors. And how do we address that problem? I also note that there are some significant regulatory issues that our federal regulators can't really solve for us, and the states are going to have to be involved. And I'm not sure they're ready and getting ready to do that. And finally, there are some additional legal tools in the medical space that may help us promote transparency, accountability, and safety. Rules for robots always start from Isaac Asimov's three laws for smart robots. And it's kind of interesting to see what they were, and they rather resemble the principles set out in the Belmont Report. The first one sounds like beneficence and non-maleficence. Robots aren't supposed to hurt people. The second one is sort of a loose respect for persons, that people get to say what they want done by the robot. And then justice is only tangentially addressed here through this notion that the robot might have to adjudicate conflicts between commands it's given and its other imperatives that were just stated. In a similar way, justice has sort of had a short shrift in our bioethics. We've given a lot of weight over the years to autonomy and respect for persons, and done less direct thinking about the justice elements. Not that they're neglected, but just they're less forefronted. And I think that shows in the fact that bioethics has thrived in the midst of a healthcare system that's really rather unjust and leaves a lot of people out and has healthcare disparities. So I think we're in a time when the justice prong needs a little more attention than it has previously had. Now, from these rules for robots, the legal scholars got in and have come up with their rules for robots and AI systems. And one of the principles the lawyers have tended to follow is that the rules shouldn't be for robots, they should be for the people who use them and design them and allow ourselves to be controlled in some settings by them. And an example of this is Jack Balkin's 3 laws of robotics. And I'll return to these and we'll discuss them later. I know it's frustrating on Zoom for the audience that is trying to read something and the person flashes through, but we'll return to this. And then Frank Pasquale has a recent book that also is stating some principles that are more directed at the people who design and use robots. The question is, these rules that are being designed and discussed, they seem to address the role of AI in society, and are they the right rules for medical AI? And I want to start by discussing what I mean by medical AI. This reflects some work FDA has done in recent years to try to bring within its jurisdiction to regulate software that is not embedded in a hardware medical device. FDA has always been able to regulate the embedded software, such as software in a cardiac device, but they have sought to get to make the point that software could itself be treated as a device that FDA can regulate. This is the definition of a device, and you can see that medical software is a contrivance, and in some cases it's intended to diagnose diseases, and so it does sort of fit within FDA's mandate. There was concern that FDA might reach too broadly and regulate too much health-related software, so the industry worked with Congress, and at the end of 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act put some limits on FDA's ability. For example, software that you use to schedule an appointment, not FDA regulated. Fitness trackers, not FDA regulated. Simple EHR software is not FDA regulated as long as it doesn't process the data to give diagnoses. Down here at the bottom is the type of software I'm going to be talking about today, clinical decision support software, which can venture into the process of diagnosing, curing, mitigating, preventing, and treating disease. Congress decided that some of this should be regulated by FDA and some should not be. This is how FDA conceives clinical decision support software. It's algorithms that take data about a particular patient, such as the patient's test results, and combine that with some source of general medical information. And the purpose is to provide recommendations to healthcare professionals about diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of disease. So it's kind of implicit here that you have healthcare professionals that are mediating the experience that the patient has with this software. So it's not a fully autonomous robotic situation, such as that Isaac Asimov was concerned about. Just flipping back through those rules we talked about earlier, how relevant are these to the medical software context? You can see here that really these rules don't seem apt because of the human intermediation that's implicit in CDS software. And certainly that last one is sort of a robot protecting itself, like the HAL computer in 2001. That doesn't seem to be an issue with medical software. So these rules don't quite seem the right ones. Turning to Balkin's rules, he felt that people that develop and use this software should be information fiduciaries. Healthcare professionals already are. They're under a fiduciary obligation and confidentiality obligations. So that's already done by existing health law. The second law here, physicians don't have public duties directly. Their duty is to the patient that's before them. So once again, that doesn't seem perfectly fitting for the physician-patient relationship. This third one potentially has some applicability that we'll return to. As for Pasquale's law, this notion that robots would replace professionals is not really going to play out with clinical decision support software. And part of that is legal. The software designers don't want to supplant the role of healthcare professionals. The healthcare professional, while in the loop, is a target for tort liability that deflects lawyers from the scent of the software developer. And from a regulatory standpoint, the fourth one here, robotic systems and AI used in healthcare, if they're FDA regulated, have to indicate the identity. So once again, these rules seem apt for non-medical settings, but some of the issues are so critical that they've already been addressed in healthcare. So what are the concerns that need to be addressed with AI medical software? First, I want to be specific where AI becomes an issue with clinical decision support software. That term encompasses a very wide range of technologies, some of which are quite simple, such as a system that sends an alarm if a healthcare provider is about to prescribe a drug that's contraindicated for the specific patient. These simple rules-based software apply already established medical knowledge to individual decision-making based on things like clinical practice guidelines, FDA-approved drug labeling, established clinical practice, or peer-reviewed literature. Those are not the focus of concern about AI and machine learning clinical decision support software. Another class of clinical decision support software is what I'm calling advanced software. It analyzes data from real-world clinical encounters to infer new general medical knowledge and brings those new insights to bear on individual patient decision making. These do frequently use AI and ML software, and the point of this, or the goal, is to push the knowledge base past the limits of what we already know. Because what we already know, the established rule-based software, is applying knowledge that in some ways is incomplete or defective. It reflects clinical trials that may not have been totally inclusive. There's missing data for medically underserved populations. Clinical practice guidelines are sometimes tainted by commercial conflicts, and peer-reviewed literature has its own bias, such as the tendency to publish things where the drug proved effective. So the software we're focusing on here has a lot of promise, but it brings with it some concerns that are related to the use of the AIML software. This is a chart that I'm borrowing from Eric Huang. It's very interesting here. It's looking at, the red line is old traditional statistical learning. This is the stuff I used when I was getting my PhD back in the 1980s. And the other lines compare it to various sizes of neural networks, which are advanced machine learning software. The performance of these different types of software varies depending on how much data is available to them. And you see that for small data sizes, the old traditional methods are sometimes better than the fancy new machine learning technology. To reap the benefits of the neural networks, you need very large data sizes. So that implies that getting the benefits of these technologies will force us to address some serious privacy concerns because of the need to use large data sets. Now, the discussion of why I think this class of software in medical context needs some special thinking. We need bioethicists and people who regularly work in healthcare to be theorizing the problems here. The privacy and data access concerns are somewhat distinctive in a medical setting because medical privacy law is somewhat different from general privacy law, and I'll elaborate on that. And as I mentioned before, the models of medical privacy protection we're using may not suffice for the challenge ahead. And then there's what I call a strange internalization of the cost of protecting privacy. Things that lawyers and ethicists instinctively want to do to protect people's privacy, such as having strong consent rights, could introduce bias into the software so that the people we're protecting suffer genuine healthcare harms as a result. So these relationships are a little different. This is a statement that was in an article by Franklin Miller, and I point out he was discussing this point of view, but not necessarily endorsing it himself. But there are certainly many who believe that even if using somebody's data has an enormous wide social benefit, and even if obtaining consent would be impracticable, and even if leaving out non-consenters could bias data sets, that's still not a valid ethical reason to use data without consent. I think this view is very widely held, and I'm questioning that view in my talk today. What we've encountered in the past when thinking about consent for data uses is this notion that there are individual burdens to data uses, but social benefits, so that the cost of not using data are externalized to society at large. And what's happening with the AI software, if a given individual and people like that individual are left out of the training data sets for AIML CDS software, that software will not produce good results for that person. And we see this already. There are some clinical decision support tools for diagnosing skin cancer that work really well on people with lighter complexions, but don't work well on people with darker complexions because they were not in the training data set. And we see other problems where women are often not in the data sets that we use to train medical software, and then the results it provides are not relevant to women. So if one is left out of the training data set, one is then at risk for bad medical decisions to the extent our physicians are relying on this software as an aid. So it's sort of, that's what I mean when I say the costs of privacy are internalized here. A person who really wants not to have data used in these systems is going to get bad performance out of those systems, and that's a very genuine risk. Now, another aspect of privacy is that it's often criticized as blocking access to data for socially beneficial uses. The HIPAA privacy rule is a very misunderstood regulation. It isn't like the common rule. It's not primarily a consent and de-identification privacy scheme. Those are included in it, but it has about 20 other norms that try to reflect flows of information that traditionally were necessary in and around the healthcare industry. One of those norms that HIPAA allows is that providers should be permitted to disclose health information without a patient's authorization to provide health care to other patients. This causes a lot of discomfort to bioethicists and privacy lawyers, the thought that my data can be shared without my doctor consulting with me to help other patients. Fortunately, it can only be shared to another healthcare professional, which means it would be going to someone who is under a strong duty of confidentiality. This is the so-called treatment exception. When thinking of access to data for training and operating clinical decision support software, that software has a treatment purpose. In theory, flows of data to that software fit within this exception. So that could mitigate the problem of accessing data for use in these systems. Now, there are a lot of technicalities. It means you could share it with a healthcare system that's HIPAA covered, not necessarily with a software developer. And so that may have some knock-on effects of privileging healthcare systems in developing clinical decision support software and some other effects we need to talk about. But getting access to data is not the issue. Getting access to well-curated data is an issue because it takes a lot more than just the data to have workable data sets for these systems. Now, in 2011, as it was first starting to consider changes to the common rule, OHRP made this statement in one of its rulemaking documents, questioning whether the traditionally constituted IRB has appropriate expertise regarding data protections to protect people's privacy. I think that was a very lucid statement. We have emphasized consent rights as the tool for protecting privacy and secondarily de-identification. That does not protect privacy very well. Privacy really is a function of how data are used computationally, what computations we do, how we structure those computations. They're a function of the data architectures. There is a growing body of literature on privacy by design in engineering where you design a system and design an algorithm to protect the privacy of people whose data are used in it. I'm sorry that the emphasis on consent in bioethics and to some degree in our privacy laws has caused policymakers not to harness the potential of these engineering privacy solutions. So the work I'm doing now is an early work in progress. And one of the things I'm going to be emphasizing is, do we need to work our analysis of privacy in a direction that will harness these techniques that can improve privacy even in settings where consent will not function to protect it? Now, the remaining two problems are about regulatory oversight and where we need oversight to occur and what sort of legal tools we have to enforce transparency, accountability, and safety. To discuss this, I need to dig a little deeper into how Congress has authorized FDA to regulate clinical decision support software. My next chart's a really busy one, and I'd ask you to focus first on the top of it. As I mentioned before, with clinical decision support software, Congress gave FDA authority to regulate some of it, but not all of it. And when you unpack the language of the 21st Century Cures Act, this is my attempt to sort it out into three different boxes. Some software that arguably meets the definition of clinical decision support is really functioning as part of a medical device. And an example I'd give you is the bioinformatics software in a gene sequencing analyzer that's processing the image files through to the point where you have identified a person's variants. Yes, in a remote way, that's helping clinicians make decisions, but it's so obscure and buried inside the hardware device that it's really part of the device. That's my box on the left. FDA is allowed to regulate that. Then the other two boxes are the more mainstream clinical decision support software that's going to make recommendations to healthcare professionals about how to diagnose, treat, or prevent disease in a particular patient. Congress split that into two boxes. And now if you'll look down below is the very turgid statutory criterion for deciding what is not regulated. And that's a very hard sentence to unpack. The way I read it, it's saying, does the software developer or vendor intend when they design the algorithm that the clinician would be able to understand how the algorithm works and decide to override what the machine is recommending? That's kind of the concept of explainable AI that Congress was trying to capture. And the way Congress saw it, if software is not explainable, if it is so obscure that the physician won't really understand how the software is making its recommendations, Congress wants FDA to regulate that software. On the other hand, if a physician using the software could understand why it's making the recommendation it's making and be able to query it and perhaps reject the recommendation, then at that point, the physician is fully in control. And this is a medical practice issue rather than an FDA issue of whether to allow that software to be used in the clinic. So Congress does not let FDA regulate the explainable software. That was the very difficult jurisdictional line that Congress drew to delimit FDA's authority. Now, that's really hard. The question is that a workable standard that FDA is going to be able to apply and describe and enforce? How is it going to assess that intent? what if the software developer says, I intend for this not to be used as the sole basis of clinical decision making, but then physicians get the software and use it that way anyway? Traditionally in FDA practice, if someone is misusing something off-label, that doesn't negate the manufacturer's intent. So it would still be considered that the software vendor intended it not to be used that way. And there's real questions of how could FDA ever disprove if a software vendor says, oh, I intended it not to be used as the sole means of decision making. Could FDA enunciate standards of algorithmic transparency that the algorithm has to do this, this, and this, and then we'll deem it to be explainable? Could you do clinical studies, have clinicians use the software and then ask them, do you understand how it made the decision? This problem of how to deal with this standard is not resolved at this time. FDA has made 2 attempts to do so. In its first guidance in 2017, FDA proposed that simple rules-based clinical decision supportware that's using publicly available sources of information, such as clinical practice guidelines, would be deemed explainable and FDA would not regulate that. But anything complicated, FDA seemed to be saying they were going to deem that to be unexplainable and regulated. Well, that's a problem because AI and machine learning software can have quite a bit of explainability. Efforts are underway to figure out how to make it more explainable. And if you just deem everything to be unexplainable, there's no incentive for developers to invest to make their products more explainable. So they got a lot of pushback and came out with a second guidance in 2019. And here they at least acknowledged that explainability is a key issue. But once again, they didn't explain how they plan to assess it and apply the concept in practice and oversee false assertions about explainability. So this is very much still up in the air at this time. Back to this chart. FDA has authority to regulate the 2 boxes that are shown at left here. And as I've mentioned, the line of what is explainable is still very fuzzy, and FDA is pushing to take a broad view of what is not explainable to expand its jurisdiction. But when you look at this, there's a huge role that state regulators are going to have to play. The non-explainable, non-FDA or FDA regulated software, when it gets to the clinic, is not explainable. So do we need medical practice guidelines? Do we need licensing provisions that require physicians that are using these types of software to have certain additional training? Do we need do we need to license healthcare facilities that are applying this software to make them have a certain code, such as requiring that patients be consented and be aware that this software is being used in their care, or perhaps restrict the ability for the software to serve objectives other than patient care, such as cutting costs, rationing care. If it's not transparent, we need to put some limits on what is a permissible use of the software. That would fall in state regulatory jurisdiction. And I don't see states making an effort to fill that gap. Another aspect of this is states have a tremendously powerful tool called tort law, lawsuits, to try to make things transparent through court-ordered discovery of information and to compensate people who would be injured. I know tort is a dirty word in the medical community, but it actually can serve a good purpose as a backstop when regulators are struggling to protect safety. And the problem is software vendors have been masterful at escaping liability for software under a number of doctrines. and also contract practices. Their standard contracts for sale of software tend to limit their liability. And this is seen, for example, in electronic health record system vendor contracts. The hospital's buying an EHR system agrees not to sue the vendor. So there have been a lot of limits, but those limits have pertained to the traditional negligence liability. There is a whole other type of liability that may be able to be brought to bear here. It's called products liability. Traditionally, software was not considered a product. It was an information service, and product liability didn't apply to it. But the minute FDA starts regulating something, it is by legal definition a product. FDA can't regulate things that are not products. So FDA's entry into the software space makes medical software a product, which raises the possibility of strict product liability. What that means is, if you are a seller who's in the business of selling a type of product, you're expected to bear the cost of injuries that that product causes because you're profiting off the product. And you're responsible for those injuries, even if you weren't negligent, even if you were as careful as you could be in designing it, but it still hurts somebody. You can be liable. And the person who's suing can be a bystander, which means, for example, a patient who is hurt through a doctor's use of software. They can sue the software developer directly, which opens the door for suits against developers of clinical decision support software by patients who are injured by them. And there's three types actually of product liability suit, and I've given some examples. A manufacturing defect exists whenever a product isn't the way it was designed to be. So if you have a manufacturer that tells FDA, my software is intended to be explainable, but in fact the physician couldn't understand it, that would be a manufacturing defect, possibly letting patients who get injured have redress against the software developer. A design defect happens when a product is exactly the way it was designed to be, but it still isn't safe. And in medical software, the training data set is a key design feature of AI software. Choosing what patient sample do you use? That's really at the heart of designing these systems. If the software has been trained on a data set that just wasn't reflective of the general population, and it performs the way it was trained to perform, but the training data set was biased so that women get hurt or various population subgroups are not well reflected in the training data set and people get injured, that's a design defect and could be actionable. So you could have actually tort suits for inadequately generalizable data sets. And then failure to warn is just what it sounds like. If there are inadequate instructions or warnings about the risk, that's actionable. So if software developers fail to disclose that their training data sets were not reflective of all the patients that will be using the software, that could generate liability. So I know it's unpopular to say it, but I think tort liability could play a major role in forcing transparency about what's in the data set, addressing biases, and trying to be a backstop to regulatory efforts to make this type of software safe. That is the end of my prepared remarks. I'm sure there probably are some questions that have accrued. And since this is a very early work in progress, I would really welcome your insights. If you think this is crazy, tell me, and I'll take that into account. Thank you very much. I'm going to unshare now.
Great, thanks very much, Barbara, for the really interesting and thought-provoking presentation there. We do have a couple of questions coming into the Q&A, and I'll invite others to please feel free to share if you do have comments or questions. So I see one here. I'm just going to take them in order. That asks, I guess, points to the fact that there are emerging systems that show the use of similar cases to the application of similar cases to the case in question. They don't make recommendations, but they don't explain how they arrived at the list of similar cases either. How would they be treated by regulators? So I guess the process of, maybe this is referring to the development of software and justification of that software based on like cases or prior cases, and sort of thinking about that model. Yeah.
So the question is, how is the software ascertaining which past patients should be put forward as being similar or different from the one that is before the clinician? Am I understanding that correctly?
And maybe we could ask for, if Anton, if you want to clarify a little bit in the chat, please feel free. I read it maybe as a similar to maybe an argument from the perspective of bioequivalence in like a medical, in a drug context, and thinking about, technological equivalence as a model for thinking about oversight and regulation. But maybe I'm misreading it.
Okay. Could we get a clarification?
Yeah, let's get a clarification.
And then put it first up when we do.
Either one, he said.
Oh, good.
Do you want to? Yeah, you're welcome to unmute.
Yeah, if I'm unmuted, there are systems that will kind of hedge at making a recommendation, but maybe if it's a clinical diagnosis, could say, well, here are similar cases and respective diagnoses, and then it's up to the user to make the final recommendation. So technically, the system is not making a recommendation; it's just out similar cases, but it's not exactly explaining how those similarities were arrived at. So it's kind of a, there's a spectrum of decision support and explainability is the dilemma.
Well, in its 2019 guidance, in a different context, FDA suggested that it will scrutinize software as potentially unexplainable if it is ruling out data points in a way that the clinician won't be able to know what got ruled out. And what you're describing sounds very similar to that. In principle, though, it could be explainable if the software gives very detailed information of the criteria it used when screening patients and selecting them to be comparators. Then that could be perfectly understandable to the clinician. We look for people with this diagnosis and this age band and that had these comorbidities, and that could be perfectly transparent, and where the software is explaining exactly how it picked those people. If it's doing something more murky, though, so that deep neural networks parse the universe in ways that don't make any intuitive sense to human beings. If it's doing something really strange like that, it could be unexplainable. So that would be a question that the software vendor would need to take a position on. Are they making it explainable or not? What is their intent?
Thank you. I also think that it was implicit in your comments that rule-based software could also be statistical, could be formula-based, could be a traditional statistical model, which oftentimes are difficult to explain as well. So I don't think that rule-based systems should necessarily be off the hook in terms of explainability either. Well, it's a strange way to partition the world.
Well, that's a very good point. That partitioning was reflecting the way FDA presented it in that 2017. They gave examples. If it's using clinical practice guidelines, FDA approved label, a public genomic database that associates variants with diseases, if it's something that's published and publicly available, that was the concept of rule-based. I agree with you. Something that's rule-based, the rules can be of any complexity in theory, and some of them would venture into non-explainable. If anything, I would say my use of the word rule-based here was perhaps not the right use of the word.
Thanks, Anton. Thanks, Barbara. We have a number of other questions, so I'm just going to run right along through them. Diane Hoffman's asking, she says, is a basic question regarding FDA regulation in software. Does it extend to LDTs or only if the software is used directly by the physician or other healthcare providers? And I assume LDTs is referring to what, laboratory developed tests, I believe?
Yes, lab developed tests. Yes, there is an ongoing question about whether FDA can regulate lab developed tests, which are tests that are developed within a high complexity clinical laboratory for use by the laboratory to render results to the public. That remains in dispute. However, a lot of laboratories use software or outsource the bioinformatics pipeline now to vendors, and that is medical software that FDA can regulate. So we face a situation where FDA may be able to regulate the software used in LDTs, even if it, in theory, can't regulate the LDT itself. And FDA has, in both of its guidances, but particularly in 2019, given a very expansive interpretation that just said, we can regulate genomic software. And whether or not it is clinical decision support software, we can regulate it. So the agency is saying they should take a very expansive view of that. I file comments in that saying, no, you don't, that's too broad, but they don't always listen to law professors.
Thanks. I'm going to combine just two questions here. They're both about the product liability approach. And one is from Deborah asking whether there are any kind of hints or signs out there that product liability cases are developing or emerging in this area. And the other relates to the issue with what David's raising here, underrepresentative training data being considered a design defect. And if it's nearly impossible for training data to be fully representative of all cases and people, would that make us, that lend itself to a scenario where, design defect cases would be brought left and right? Yeah.
Those are both great questions. And I'm going to take Deborah's question first. And in the meantime, I'll forget the second question and need a reminder. Sure. Right now, we are not seeing the product liability suits with clinical decision support software. And I think we're not seeing a lot of suits of any type, negligence or strict product liability around them. And part of this is the software is new, it's just rolling into the clinic. Patients who have a bad medical outcome may not even know the software contributed to it, and the causation is devilishly hard to show. If someone is injured, how do you show that the software did it? And we have these long-standing court biases against software liability for a lot of reasons. The main impediment, and also the feeling is that the clinician who uses the software is going to be the sink for liability. That's where the liability would go. And that's very unfortunate for clinicians. And I think one useful thing about having product liability is it could direct some of the liability elsewhere and perhaps contribute to a greater willingness to use these tools. But right now, everything's up in the air. We haven't really seen a lot of litigated cases, and it's down the road, but it isn't here yet. The second question, let's see if I could remember it.
Yeah, it was a question about the issue with explainability. Sorry, I'm just pulling it up here as well. Underrepresentative training data being considered a design defect.
Yes, this requires me to go one step deeper into how design defects are assessed in law. For any complex product, such as a car, or certainly this type of software, they use, most states use a theory of reasonable alternative design. Can you show that there was another way to design this product that would not have had this defect? To some degree, all data sets available at this time are a little biased, a little non-inclusive. So you don't have to have a perfect data set if you're a software developer to win one of these cases. You just have to show that you had a data set that was reasonable given what else was out there. And a software developer who had a slightly biased data set could show that, for example, it would have been just prohibitively expensive to get data for everybody, or that these were the available data and it would have delayed things by 10 years to get more data. So the design defect standard does not require you to have a perfect data set or a perfectly unbiased data set. It just requires you to have as good as can reasonably be acquired at a given time. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. We have a number of questions or comments about explainability. So maybe we could try to address those. So the first is, are image classification algorithms, for example, used in radiology, considered explainable or not? And I think this relates to a later comment about how the law currently defines explainable, and noting that there are a number of different prudential definitions and certainly different people to whom things would need to be explained and to what depth and those kinds of things. So.
Yeah, and law doesn't really define explainability, at least FDA doesn't. That standard I showed you, the 360 standard that was at the bottom of the chart that's so convoluted, FDA is going to make its decision not based on whether software is objectively explainable, but on whether the software manufacturer intended for it to be explainable, which is taking it another remove from explainability. And Congress delegated it to FDA to figure out what explainable means under that definition. And FDA is struggling with it. So it's not completely clear at this point. As to the specific question about a particular type of algorithm used in radiology, what does that algorithm do? Does it calculate the dose internally to a machine that's administering radiation? I'm not familiar with the use case.
I'm not sure if maybe if whoever posted that would like to follow up, that would be great. I'm assuming it maybe relates to using machine learning algorithms to identify, to do a better job at identifying, meaningful indicators on radiographs and those kinds of things.
Yeah, machine learning, FDA has been approving products I was thinking perhaps that radiology application was something that's embedded in hardware. FDA has already for years been regulating many types of AI and ML software that is embedded software that's part of a device, such as a MRI machine, a radiology machine, whatever. And FDA is able to regulate them. And when the software is embedded in a hardware device, there's no question that FDA can regulate it. So this obsessing about is it explainable or not is coming up because for non-embedded software that's standalone software, that determines FDA's role. But FDA has various ways it can use. You can even do a clinical study where you have a clinician, one group of clinicians that are using an AI tool and another group that are not using it, and see which group gets better patient outcomes. So there are ways to to deal with it. I don't want to suggest that because it's unexplainable, it's going to be impossible to get it through FDA. The context of clinical decision support software, it's an issue of whether FDA can regulate it at all.
Thanks. And maybe just one more question on explainability here. I see someone in the chat has posted actually asking, if there's a sort of disincentive or an incentive in this regulatory scheme for companies to then develop products that are simpler and maybe even less effective, perhaps, just to be able to avoid that kind of regulations. But I think there's another comment here too that maybe you could address alongside that, which is how do you confirm that or how does the FDA or anyone confirm that a system is in fact explaining things correctly? So how do we know? Yeah. Let's see if you'd like to address either one of those or both, you're welcome to.
What was the first one again? I'm sorry.
First one was about FDA regulations might lead companies to use simpler and maybe less powerful algorithms in order to be explainable and remain unregulated. Yeah.
Well, I think that is a big concern, is that if you keep software on the simple side and FDA deems you to be within explainability criteria, you get the benefit of not being FDA regulated, which is nice not to have to deal with. And then also, if you say this is so simple, physicians can understand it and they will know what to do, you're pointing all the tort liability at the physician. If the physician who could understand it gets a bad patient outcome, then you can make the case in court that, well, that physician didn't use it right. So we do want to avoid having there be incentives to keep things simple, but I think there is going to be ongoing development of the more complex software. My concern is that if FDA deems it all to be subject to FDA regulation, then there's no incentive to try to make it more explainable because, with the goal of getting out of being FDA regulated. That was only the first question, but are we out of time?
Yeah, we're reaching the end. I think we have time maybe for one more question here. I think I will maybe go with, I don't know, the next one on the list here in terms of time of posting. So regarding rule-based, RODIF, the publicly available genetic databases, was itself biased, e.g. including primarily data from people of European descent. So, yeah.
Well, this is a problem also with our practice guidelines with information in FDA-approved drug labeling tends to be based on clinical trials that preferentially represent white males. So the rule-based software can be very biased because there's bias in the sources of information from which it came. And so, yes, bias isn't a problem that's unique to AI software. And AI software, in fact, is something that can help us get around the bias of our existing knowledge base.
I think we may actually have time just for one more to squeeze it in because we have so many great comments and questions here. I'd love to, if that's all right.
I hope you'll keep all the questions. Maybe I can respond to them offline.
We'd love to, and usually we try to unmute more colleagues to speak, but I think we have so many coming in. I just wanted to keep us going here. So Emmy Hood asks, does tort and liability of software companies have a stronger argument in context of DTC health softwares, fitness apps, menstrual fertility trackers, etc., where the traditional healthcare provider is cut out of the middle?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, my case that product liability applies rests on the fact that FDA is regulating it. That is a federal determination that the software is a medical product, which puts you in product liability. The fitness trackers and a lot of the direct to consumer stuff, to the extent it's not FDA regulated, it can make the traditional case of we're not a product, we're a service, we're not subject to product liability. So I'm pessimistic if a direct consumer software company is not FDA regulated, then they're going to be able to try to say we're not providing a product, we're just providing information services.
All right, well, with that, I think we'll wrap up for the hour, and just thank you again, Barbara, for this really interesting seminar. And I'm sure everybody would be clapping if we were in person, but you just have to imagine that. We did go to present to you, I think, a number of different questions that you somehow managed to navigate masterfully. So thanks again, and thanks everyone for joining us for today's seminar. Look forward to our next one, which is in about 2 weeks. Thanks very much.